The late afternoon sun draped the town in a warm, golden hush, casting long shadows across the wooden boardwalks and dust-covered roads. It was the kind of small western settlement where everyone knew one another, where children played barefoot. In the fields, and the scent of fresh bread mixed with the scent of horses, life moved slowly, steadily, and safely, or so it seemed. Amid this everyday stillness was 5-year-old Elsie Mae Harper, a bright-eyed girl with sun-kissed cheeks, and a mop of wild curls tied back with a fraying ribbon. She was the youngest daughter of Thomas Harper, the town's carpenter, and Martha, who spent most of her days tending the garden and stitching clothes for the neighbors. Elsie single quotes' world was simple and full of small wonders. The swing hanging from the sycamore tree, the dandelions that grew behind the water trough, the dusty jars of buttons her mother kept on the windowsill. But her most treasured possession, without question, was her cloth doll, lovingly named Button, a gift sewn by her grandmother 2 winters prior. The doll had button eyes that didn't match, a faded blue dress, and stuffing that had begun to clump from years of handling. Yet to Elsie, Button wasn't just a toy. She was a friend, a confidant, and the anchor of every game and bedtime story. The two were rarely apart, except when Button took the occasional trip to the washing basin and came back smelling of soap and sunshine. That particular day had begun like any other, with children laughing and playing beneath the cottonwoods and mothers calling them in for chores. But everything shifted when the sound of hooves echoed down the dirt road, growing louder by the second. Heads turned, conversations stilled, and shopkeepers stepped out of their stores. A small procession of native families, riders on horseback, wrapped in dust and silence, approached the town from the western hills. They rode slowly, with the solemn grace of those who had traveled far. Horses with braided manes and colorful, woven saddle blankets kicked up the red dust as they passed. Townsfolk watched with a mix of curiosity, unease, and distant caution. The settlers had grown used to the occasional traveling band, but tensions always simmered quietly beneath the surface, born from misunderstanding, fear, and history too. Complicated for a child like Elsie to know. As the procession neared the center of town, Elsie sat on her porch swing, her legs too short to touch the floor, humming softly as she brushed Button's dress with her fingers. She didn't notice the whispers around her or the wary glances of neighbors pulling their children close. Her eyes were fixed on the line of riders, and on one little girl in particular. She rode behind a tall woman with long black hair tied in copper beads, clinging loosely to her waist. The child's face was streaked with dust and tears, her small frame drooping with exhaustion. Her dress was worn and her expression hollow. To Elsie, she looked not foreign or frightening, but sad and scared, like a child who'd lost something dear. Their eyes met, even if just for a second. There was no malice, no barrier of language or culture in that look. Only 2 children, separated by fate and heritage, but united in their understanding of sadness. Elsie didn't know why the girl cried. She only knew that something inside her chest tightened, and in that instant she knew exactly what to do. Before her mother could stop her, before anyone could ask what she was thinking, Elsie slid down from the porch swing and padded barefoot across the road. The crowd watched, murmuring some gasp. Her little hands clutched Button tightly, her heart pounding, but her steps never wavered. She approached the line of riders, stopping just a few feet away from the crying girl's horse. The woman riding ahead turned her head, eyes sharp and observant, but she said nothing. The little girl leaned forward, eyes wide with surprise. Elsie held out her doll. There was no speech, no explanation, no dramatic moment of ceremony. Just a child giving something she loved to someone who looked like she needed it more. The native girl reached out, hesitating, then took Button gently in her hands. The doll looked small in the child's grip, and yet enormous in meaning. Their eyes locked again. A small tentative smile touched the girl's lips. Then the riders continued on, fading slowly down the road, leaving behind only hoofprints and a silence thick with awe. Elsie turned and walked back to her porch, empty-handed, but her heart somehow fuller than before. No one knew what that small act would mean, not yet, but the wind shifted slightly through the sycamores, as if carrying the beginning of a story none of them could yet imagine. The townspeople were stunned into silence. The usual chatter of the marketplace had vanished like smoke in the wind. It was as if every eye in the village had watched little Elsie Mae cross the dirt road and offer up her only doll to a girl whose name they would never know. Some mothers gasped, instinctively reaching for their own children. A few old men on the general store porch stood with their mouths slightly open, the rims of their dusty hats lowered to shade their astonished eyes. Even the blacksmith, who usually never looked up from his forge, had paused mid-hammer stroke. But Elsie didn't notice any of them. Her world had shrunk in that moment to 2 children and one simple gesture, the handing over of Button. The native girl, still perched behind her mother on the horse, clutched the doll as if she'd been handed something sacred. Her fingers trembled around the faded fabric, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and wonder. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her expression said everything: gratitude, confusion, and a deep, aching kind of relief. The woman riding ahead, perhaps the girl's mother or aunt, gave Elsie the briefest nod. Not a smile, not a word, just a subtle dip of her head that acknowledged something real had passed between the children. Then, without a word, the riders moved on, heading east out of town, with dust trailing behind them like smoke from an extinguished fire. Elsie turned slowly, still barefoot in the road, her hands now empty. The space between her fingers felt strange, without Button nestled there. But she didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She walked back to her porch with quiet dignity, climbed the steps, and resumed her place on the swing, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Only her eyes wandered now, looking down the path the riders had taken, a question in her gaze she couldn't quite name. Behind her, Martha Harper's hands were pressed tightly over her heart, while Thomas stood still beside the doorframe, his jaw clenched, blinking back a strange sheen in his eyes. A hush lingered across the street, even after the riders vanished from view. Slowly, life began to stir again. People returned to their conversations, though their words were softer now, almost reverent. A few folks murmured to one another, glancing toward the Harper house. Some offered kind nods as they passed, though others looked uneasy, as if unsure whether Elsie's gesture had been sweet or something dangerous. In a town where many carried old fears and stories passed down in whispers, kindness toward outsiders, especially native people, was often viewed with suspicion. Inside the Harper home, however, the mood was different. As the family sat down to supper that evening, the silence at the table wasn't heavy with scolding or confusion, but with a quiet pride. Thomas, never a man of many words, finally said, "She did more in a minute than most do in a lifetime." Martha nodded, wiping a corner of her eye. Elsie, chewing on cornbread, only shrugged. She was sad, she said simply, as if that answered everything. And perhaps it did. When bedtime came, Elsie climbed under her quilt, her arms instinctively reaching for Button, only to remember she was gone. Her hands fell to her sides. There was a tiny ache in her chest, a flicker of loneliness. But instead of crying, she whispered a soft goodnight to Button, wherever she was. Martha leaned down, tucking the blanket under her daughter's chin, and promised, "We'll make you another, sweetheart, a new Button, even better." But Elsie shook her head and whispered, that one was for her. She needed it more. It was the kind of answer that silenced even the deepest worries of a mother's heart. Outside, the wind blew gently through the branches of the sycamore. The town lay still beneath a sky full of stars, unaware of what that simple act of giving had set into motion. Elsie drifted into sleep without the comfort of her doll for the first time in years. But somehow, it didn't feel like a loss. In its place was something invisible, something glowing and good. The quiet knowing that a moment of kindness, offered freely and without reward, had stitched something powerful into the fabric of the world. That night, the town fell into a hush deeper than usual, as though something sacred had settled over it. Oil lamps flickered behind curtains, and chimney smoke twisted into the dark sky like ribbon. Inside the Harper home, the soft creak of wood and the distant bark of a dog were the only sounds accompanying the quiet. Supper had come and gone. Martha had washed the plates in silence while Thomas carved a piece of walnut wood at the kitchen table. But the heart of the home, the emotional warmth that always came from laughter or stories, was gentler now. Reverent, like the way one lowers their voice in a chapel. Elsie sat near the fire, hugging her knees, watching the flames dance behind the metal grate. She wasn't fidgeting or restless the way she sometimes was after sundown. She just stared into the fire, her little brow furrowed, not with worry, but with thoughtfulness far beyond her 5 years. Her doll Button was gone, given away, without hesitation, but the weight of that decision hadn't struck her as regretful. Still, the absence was real. Her arms knew it, her bedtime knew it. There were echoes of Button everywhere. Martha noticed it too. She had quietly taken out her sewing kit, the same one her mother had used to make her own dolls long ago. She set it gently on the table beside her husband and began rifling through cloth scraps, floral prints, old blue cotton, lace-edged handkerchiefs. She didn't say anything, but the look she exchanged with Thomas said enough. They'd make her a new doll, not to replace Button, but to honor what Button had become, a gift of pure compassion. Thomas was quieter than usual. His carving knife paused in the wood. I saw the way the elder looked at her. He finally said, "That wasn't just a thank you. That was something else." Martha nodded. It's not every day a child does something like that with no one asking her to. There was a hint of awe in her voice, as though she was still trying to understand how such a small child had shown such deep, instinctive empathy. But that was Elsie, born soft-hearted and unshakably kind. As the house began to settle for the night, Thomas lifted Elsie into his arms and carried her to bed. She laid her head on his shoulder without a word. He tucked her beneath her patchwork quilt, kissed her forehead, and stepped back. But as he reached to blow out the lamp, she asked softly, "Do you think she'll take care of Button?" Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile and hopeful. Thomas smiled faintly and nodded. "I think she already is." That seemed enough. Elsie closed her eyes, her lashes fluttering against her cheeks as she drifted toward sleep. In the moments before darkness took the room, Martha lingered by the door, watching her daughter breathe slowly, peacefully. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The world outside their home was complicated and unpredictable. The relationship between settlers and native tribes had always been tense, shaped by generations of suspicion and conflict. But something had shifted today. A bridge had been built, not by treaties or town meetings, but by a child with nothing to gain. As the fire in the hearth burned low, and the house grew quiet, the Harper parents sat together by the kitchen table once more. The sewing kit opened between them. Martha stitched by lamplight, her fingers nimble and sure. She wasn't trying to create another button. She knew better than to recreate something irreplaceable. Instead, she imagined a new doll, with brown yarn hair and a patchwork dress. Something made with the same tenderness her daughter had shown to that crying girl. Thomas, beside her, continued carving, this time not a shelf bracket or a chair leg, but something smaller. A horse, perhaps, a gift, something that could carry meaning without words. And beyond the window, the wind moved gently through the trees, rustling the leaves like soft whispers. In the hills beyond town, where the native riders had disappeared hours earlier, campfires flickered against the dark like stars on the ground. In one of those tents, the girl who now held Button likely slept with the doll clutched to her chest, the fabric holding not just stuffing, but a piece of someone else's kindness. Neither she nor Elsie knew it, but the invisible thread between them had already begun to stretch across distance and difference, binding them in a story that others would one day tell, not of conflict, but of quiet giving and the sacred power of one child's heart. Morning broke with a soft golden light that spilled across the plains, brushing rooftops and fences with warmth. Birds began their chorus early, as if even they sensed the world had changed in some quiet way. In the Harper household, the day started as it always did. Thomas rose before the sun, stoked the fire, and poured water from the pump into a basin. Martha followed soon after, pulling bread from the oven and preparing breakfast. But when Elsie padded sleepily into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes and yawning, something in the air felt different, like the hush before a song begins. Thomas glanced out the window first. He paused mid-sip of coffee, his brow furrowing. Then, he stood slowly and leaned closer to the glass. "Martha," he said, his voice low and curious. She turned from the stove, drying her hands. "What is it?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He simply opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. Elsie followed him, still in her nightdress, her small feet bare against the wooden planks. Martha came next, her apron dusted with flour. All three stood in silence as their eyes adjusted to the sight before them. At the edge of their front yard, where the road met the tall prairie grass, stood a group of figures, solemn and still. They hadn't ridden in with noise or fanfare. There were no war cries, no drums, no show of power, only calm presence. 4 native elders stood side by side, each draped in garments that shimmered with beadwork, feathers, and leather stitched by careful hands. Behind them waited 3 young men holding woven baskets and bundles wrapped in animal hide. At their side stood a child, the same girl Elsie had given her doll to the day before. Button was clutched tightly in her arms. The air stood still. As 2 worlds looked upon each other, there was no crowd this time, no gathering of townsfolk, just the Harpers, barefoot and blinking in the morning sun, and the visitors who had come without warning. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind rustled gently through the prairie grass. Then one of the elders stepped forward, a tall man with white braids, sharp cheekbones, and eyes full of storm and memory. In his hands, he held something wrapped in a faded blue cloth. He walked slowly across the yard until he stood just feet away from Thomas. He did not speak in English, at least not at first. He murmured something in his own language, melodic, rhythmic, like the wind through canyon walls. Then, as if sensing the gap, he placed a hand to his chest and said, in halting English, "This, for your child." His voice was deep, but gentle. He extended the bundle forward. Thomas did not move at first. He looked from the man to the bundle, then to the child at his side. Elsie stared wide-eyed, recognizing Button immediately. The little girl, the visitor, smiled faintly and gave a tiny nod, as though assuring her the doll had been cared for. Then Elsie stepped forward, small and quiet, and looked up at the elder. He knelt to her height, unwrapping the cloth with great care, revealing what lay inside. It was a carved wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread, intricately etched with symbols, birds, rivers, spirals of wind, and inlaid with bone and turquoise. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. The elder opened the lid. Inside lay a single white eagle feather, a small bundle of herbs tied with sinew, and a smooth river stone painted with a red sun. Martha gasped quietly. Thomas took off his hat. The elder said, "This is sacred. From our people, it is not payment, it is not trade, it is respect." He gestured to Elsie. She gave from her spirit. "We return with spirit." No one spoke. Tears welled in Martha's eyes as she placed a hand on Elsie's shoulder. The child looked down into the box, fascinated but confused. "Why a feather?" she whispered. The elder smiled, pointing to her heart. "Because your heart flies. Like this." And in that moment, something passed between them again. Not words, not ideas, but recognition. Of purity, of truth, of what happens when kindness is given without asking, and returned without expectation. The group of visitors placed the box gently on the porch, nodded once more, and began to turn back toward the road. They left as silently as they had come, but they left something behind far more lasting than a gift. They left a message, and his Button's cloth dress fluttered in the breeze from the arms of a now smiling girl, and the eagle feathers shimmered in the light of the rising sun. The Harpers understood. Something sacred had taken root, not in the yard, not in the box, but in the heart of a child who had simply offered what she loved most. Morning broke with a soft golden light that spilled across the plains, brushing rooftops and fences with warmth. Birds began their chorus early, as if even they sensed the world had changed in some quiet way. In the Harper household, the day started as it always did. Thomas rose before the sun, stoked the fire, and poured water from the pump into a basin. Martha followed soon after, pulling bread from the oven and preparing breakfast. But when Elsie padded sleepily into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes and yawning, something in the air felt different, like the hush before a song begins. Thomas glanced out the window first. He paused mid-sip of coffee, his brow furrowing. Then, he stood slowly and leaned closer to the glass. "Martha," he said, his voice low and curious. She turned from the stove, drying her hands. "What is it?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He simply opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. Elsie followed him, still in her nightdress, her small feet bare against the wooden planks. Martha came next, her apron dusted with flour. All three stood in silence as their eyes adjusted to the sight before them. At the edge of their front yard, where the road met the tall prairie grass, stood a group of figures, solemn and still. They hadn't ridden in with noise or fanfare. There were no war cries, no drums, no show of power, only calm presence. Four native elders stood side by side, each draped in garments that shimmered with beadwork, feathers, and leather stitched by careful hands. Behind them waited three young men, holding woven baskets and bundles wrapped in animal hide. At their side stood a child, the same girl Elsie had given her doll to the day before. Button was clutched tightly in her arms. The air stood still, as two worlds looked upon each other. There was no crowd this time, no gathering of townsfolk, just the Harpers, barefoot and blinking in the morning sun, and the visitors who had come without warning. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind rustled gently through the prairie grass. Then, one of the elders stepped forward, a tall man with white braids, sharp cheekbones, and eyes full of storm and memory. In his hands, he held something wrapped in a faded blue cloth. He walked slowly across the yard until he stood just feet away from Thomas. He did not speak in English, at least not at first. He murmured something in his own language, melodic, rhythmic, like the wind through canyon walls. Then, as if sensing the gap, he placed a hand to his chest and said, in halting English, "This, for your child." His voice was deep, but gentle. He extended the bundle forward. Thomas did not move at first. He looked from the man to the bundle, then to the child at his side. Elsie stared wide-eyed, recognizing Button immediately. The little girl, the visitor smiled faintly and gave a tiny nod, as though assuring her the doll had been cared for. Then Elsie stepped forward, small and quiet, and looked up at the elder. He knelt to her height, unwrapping the cloth with great care, revealing what lay inside. It was a carved wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread, intricately etched with symbols, birds, rivers, spirals of wind, and inlaid with bone and turquoise. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. The elder opened the lid. Inside lay a single white eagle feather, a small bundle of herbs tied with sinew, and a smooth river stone painted with a red sun. Martha gasped quietly. Thomas took off his hat. The elder said, "This is sacred. From our people, it is not payment, it is not trade, it is respect." He gestured to Elsie. She gave from her spirit. "We return with spirit." No one spoke. Tears welled in Martha's eyes as she placed a hand on Elsie's shoulder. The child looked down into the box, fascinated but confused. "Why a feather?" she whispered. The elder smiled, pointing to her heart. "Because your heart flies. Like this." And in that moment, something passed between them again. Not words, not ideas, but recognition. Of purity, of truth, of what happens when kindness is given without asking, and returned without expectation. The group of visitors placed the box gently on the porch, nodded once more, and began to turn back toward the road. They left as silently as they had come, but they left something behind far more lasting than a gift. They left a message. And his Button's cloth dress fluttered in the breeze from the arms of a now smiling girl, and the eagle feather shimmered in the light of the rising sun. The Harpers understood. Something sacred had taken root, not in the yard, not in the box, but in the heart of a child who had simply offered what she loved most. The summer weeks passed gently, and with them came a subtle change in the rhythm of town life. While fences were still mended, crops tended, and horses shoed, there was now a lighter air, a quieter curiosity about the people who lived beyond. the prairie line, children began asking questions, not just about the feather or the wooden box, but about the people who gave them. School teacher, Mrs. Avery, who had once skipped over the chapters in history books that made her uneasy, now paused to explain the symbols carved into the Harper's gift. She even pinned a sketch of the box to the schoolhouse wall, encouraging her students to draw what they thought each symbol meant. Elsie had returned to her usual brightness. She ran barefoot through the fields, played in the creek, and helped her mother sweep the porch. But every so often, her face would turn still when a hawk passed overhead or when the breeze carried a sound she couldn't place. And always, she ended her days on the porch, hope in her lap, eyes fixed on the prairie horizon. She didn't expect another visit. That wasn't why she waited. It was more like a habit of hope, a way of reminding herself that kindness sent out into the world could come back in ways you might never expect. One morning, not long after the harvest had begun, a second gift arrived. But this time, it came not with visitors, not with ceremony. It came carried by the wind. At first, it was mistaken for nothing more than a bundle of feathers caught in a breeze. But when Martha stepped outside and saw it lying at the edge of the garden path, she called for Thomas. Carefully, he approached it, a small satchel of soft deerskin, tied with sinew and decorated with beads in the shape of a sunburst. Inside, they found a necklace of carved bone and turquoise, a tiny wooden animal, perhaps a fox or a coyote, and a single strip of woven fabric dyed in earthy reds and ochres. But there was no note, no signature, just the feeling that this was meant for them, or more precisely, for Elsie. When they showed it to her, she didn't squeal or gasp. She simply held the wooden animal in her palm, nodding once, as if she understood something the adults didn't. She tied the necklace around Hope's neck, tucked the fabric into her own dress pocket, and whispered, "She's still thinking of me." From that day on, Elsie began drawing, not stick figures or flower baskets like before, but scenes. Her small hands, guided by instinct more than skill, sketched girls with braids holding dolls, sunrises over wide plains, and elders offering gifts wrapped in blue cloth. Martha began keeping the drawings in a basket near the fireplace. "Someday," she said to Thomas one night, "people are going to ask what started all this. And we'll point to these." And indeed, all this was starting to grow. Other families in town, the Tanners, the Fields, even old Mr. Tillman had begun leaving baskets of bread and fruit at the edge of the prairie, not out of guilt, but out of a desire to be part of something meaningful. They didn't expect anything in return. They just wanted to say, in their own way, "We saw what happened. We felt it." One morning, a circle of stones appeared where the Harper's yard met the prairie, arranged with care, in a perfect ring. No tracks led to it. No one saw who had placed them. But Thomas stood over it a long time, hat in hand, before finally saying, "This isn't just for us anymore. It's for anyone who chooses grace over fear." That evening, a new kind of tradition was born. Families came quietly, laying flowers or tokens inside the stone circle, a music box, a child's scarf, a jar of wild honey. These weren't offerings of worship, they were acknowledgments of connection, of shared humanity. And at the heart of it all was Elsie, the girl who'd given her doll without hesitation. She never asked for anything back. But what returned was a wave of gentleness that changed an entire town. One kindness had rippled outward, shaping the wind, the land, the hearts of those who once thought they were worlds apart. Autumn came gently that year, as if the land itself had been softened by what had unfolded over the summer. Leaves turned golden and amber along the edges of the cottonwoods, and the wind that swept the plains no longer felt harsh but calming, like a whisper between old friends. Life in the small town moved on, but with an undercurrent of reverence. The Harper home became known, not just as a farmstead, but as a place where something sacred had happened, something no preacher, lawman, or a historian could quite explain. Elsie remained blissfully unaware of how much attention she'd drawn. To her, the doll she gave and the gifts she received were just part of a quiet understanding between two children. But word had traveled through letters, travelers, even a passing journalist who heard the story from a schoolteacher in a nearby county. A brief article appeared in a regional paper. Child's kindness sparks cultural exchange on the prairie. It was simple, just a few paragraphs. But it caught the attention of people far beyond the dusty roads of her small town. Soon, strangers began to arrive, not in droves, not with fanfare, but with sincerity. A missionary couple from Ohio came to speak to Thomas and Martha, curious about the ceremony and respectful in their questions. A painter from Kansas City spent 2 days sketching the carved wooden box and the circle of stones, later calling it a place where the earth feels lighter. And then there were the children, young boys and girls from other towns, brought by their parents, who had heard the tale and wanted to see the porch where a little girl had handed over a doll with nothing but hope in her heart. Elsie never quite knew what to say to these visitors. She didn't see herself as special. When asked what made her give the doll away, she'd usually shrug and say she was crying. "Button always helped me when I was sad." And that would be the end of it. She never tried to explain further. To her, kindness didn't need explaining. It just needed doing. What struck most visitors, though, wasn't the carved box or the sacred feather, but the feeling they got simply being there, as if something pure had taken root and was still growing. Quietly, among the fence posts and wildflowers, the circle of stones remained untouched, though someone, perhaps a silent visitor, perhaps a friend beyond the horizon, occasionally added to it. A feather, a braid of sweetgrass, a pebble painted with a child's name, these weren't left for show. They were left as messages, perhaps to the girl across the prairie, or perhaps to Elsie. One chilly afternoon, just before the frost came, Thomas received a letter. The envelope was handmade, sealed with wax pressed into the shape of a hawk's wing. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, handwritten in an elegant script. The message read, "To the family who gave without asking, the gift was not forgotten. The spirit of the child who gave her doll lives in our stories now. Among our people, we speak her name, not as outsider, but as heartkin. May the earth be soft beneath her feet, and may her dreams ride with the wind." There was no signature, no return address, but Thomas placed the letter beside the carved box and lit 2 candles that evening instead of 1. Martha read the words aloud to Elsie by the fire, and though the child didn't understand every phrase, she nodded solemnly. Then, without prompting, she fetched a small strip of cloth, the one that had come in the second satchel, and tied it around Hope's arm like a sash. "It means we're still friends," she said simply, "even if we don't see each other." That night, as the wind carried leaves across the roof and the moon rose bright above the plains, the Harpers sat together in silence. They didn't speak of ceremonies or signs. They didn't wonder what might happen next. They simply sat, held by a warmth deeper than the fire's glow, a warmth born not of great gestures, but of one small act of love, passed from child to child, heart to heart, until it became something sacred. Winter arrived, not with violence, but with stillness. The first snow came down in soft spirals, coating the plains like a lullaby. Smoke curled gently from chimneys. Children bundled in wool and ran laughing through the drifts. But the Harper home, tucked along the edge of the prairie, carried a quiet kind of light that no season could dim. The carved wooden box still sat above the hearth, the sacred feather untouched, now joined by the wax-sealed letter, framed in cedar, and the circle of stones remained whole, even beneath snow, its pattern gently outlined by footprints, small ones enlarged from townsfolk who came even now, just to stand and remember. Elsie grew, as all children do. Her cheeks thinned, her legs lengthened, her handwriting steadied, but what did not change was her habit of waiting, not with desperation, but with peace. She still sat by the window with Hope in her lap, or stood at the porch rail watching. The wind rippled through the grasses. She had not seen the girl with braids since the day she gave away Button. No messenger had arrived with news. But she never doubted. Not once. "Some friendships don't need visits," she would say. "They live in the in-between." In time, others took notice of the quiet bond that had blossomed across that invisible line. A new schoolteacher, inspired by Elsie's drawings, introduced lessons on native culture, not as something foreign, but as something nearby and living. Children learned to respect the names of the tribes, to understand the meaning behind a feather, a pattern, a drumbeat. Parents began to listen. They spoke more gently when discussing the people beyond the prairie. Some even reached out, with baskets, with letters, with invitations for shared meals. Years passed. The town changed. Not quickly, but surely. What began with one act of compassion, a child handing over her only doll, became a thread that wove its way into the fabric of every life around it. Couples named daughters Elsie. Local artisans began carving their own boxers, leaving them as tokens at the stone circle. And every year, on the first snowfall, families gathered by lantern light outside the Harper home, placing dolls, feathers, and bits of ribbon in the snow, not for show, but for memory, for gratitude, for the simple truth that love, when given freely, leaves echoes. Elsie, now grown into a young woman, with wind-blushed cheeks and wise eyes, never tired of the story. She never felt burdened by what had happened. When asked why she thought her doll had meant so much, she'd smile and reply, "It wasn't just a toy, it was my best thing, and I gave it away because someone needed it more." That, she always said, made the gift sacred, not because it was grand, but because it was honest. One spring morning, long after many had forgotten the details but not the feeling, a visitor came again. A woman, tall and graceful, wearing turquoise beads and a woven shawl the color of prairie fire. She stood at the edge of the Harper's yard and waited. When Elsie stepped onto the porch, Hope still in her arms, though her limbs were worn and her stitching faded, the woman smiled. Her hair was still long, still braided, and in her hand she held a doll, not Button, but one clearly made in the same spirit. She crossed the yard in silence, and without a word, offered it to Elsie. For a moment, the two stood there, like reflections across time. Then Elsie reached out, not for the doll, but for the woman's hand. And they held it not as strangers, not as symbols, but as what they had always been. Two children who once met in a moment of sadness. and stitched together something no boundary could sever. Later that evening, as the town gathered for the spring festival, Elsie placed the new doll inside the stone circle, beside the box and the feather. No plaque, no announcement, just the latest chapter in a story that had no end. A story passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, and above them all, the wind carried the laughter of children, the scent of spring grass, and the quiet wisdom of a doll given in love.